A successful rancher with an iron will and a heart of stone stopped to help a woman fix her broken wagon wheel on a dusty road outside Redemption Springs. He figured it was a simple act of courtesy, nothing more. But when dawn broke and he discovered the truth about who she really was, what she'd built with her bare hands, and what she'd sacrificed in silence while the whole town prospered. Everything he believed about hard work, success, and fairness shattered in an instant. By morning, Garrett Sullivan realized he didn't just owe her a debt, he owed her everything. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Garrett Sullivan had built his empire from dust and determination. No inheritance, no favors, no shortcuts, just sweat, grit, and an unshakable belief that if you worked hard enough, success would follow. Sullivan Freight and Cattle Company had started as a one-wagon operation, hauling supplies between Redemption Springs and Tucson, and over 15 years, it had grown into the most powerful freight and livestock business in the Arizona territory. Garrett owned half the cattle that grazed the surrounding valleys, employed nearly 40 men, and controlled the supply lines that kept Redemption Springs alive. People respected him. Some feared him. He was known as a man who never missed a deadline, who paid his workers fair wages, and who expected nothing less than total commitment in return. If you worked for Sullivan Freight, you worked to win. That was the code. That was the only way. But even a man like Garrett, with all his convictions and all his success, had blind spots. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert sky in shades of burnt orange and crimson, Garrett sat in his office above the freighty yard, reviewing the month's ledgers. The numbers were strong, profits up, shipments on schedule, everything running like a well-oiled machine. Through the window, he could see the last of the freight wagons being unloaded, workers hauling crates and barrels into the storage barn before heading home for the night. The yard was nearly empty now, just a few stragglers finishing up. But something caught his eye. Down by the loading platform, a figure lingered near the cookhouse. Clara Winters. He knew her, though not personally. She was one of those workers who never caused trouble, never complained, never needed reminding. If there was extra work, she took it. If a shift needed covering, she was there. The kind of worker every employer wanted, the kind who didn't ask for favors, which was why what he saw next didn't sit right. Clara stood near the cookhouse door, her posture hesitant, shifting her weight like she was debating whether she should even be there. The cook, a grizzled old man named Pete, stood in the doorway wiping his hands on a rag. Their conversation was brief, too quiet for Garrett to hear from his office, but he could see the way Pete's brow furrowed, the way he hesitated before finally disappearing back inside and returning with a wrapped bundle. Leftover cornbread and beans by the look of it. Clara's shoulders sagged in what looked like relief. She murmured something, probably a thank you, and quickly tucked the bundle into her satchel, glancing around as if checking to see if anyone had noticed. Then she turned and walked briskly toward the edge of the yard, head down, pace quick but deliberate. Garrett leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the armrest. He wasn't the type of boss who meddled in his workers' personal lives. That wasn't how he ran things. You worked hard, you got paid. Simple, fair. But Clara worked more than most. She pulled double shifts, sometimes even covered for men who didn't show up. If anyone should have been able to afford a hot meal, it was her. So why was she asking Pete for leftovers? The thought gnawed at him, unsettling in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she just forgot to bring supper. Maybe she was saving money for something. Maybe it wasn't his problem. Yet, as he turned back to his ledgers, the numbers blurred. The only thing his mind could focus on was that single image, Clara Winters, stuffing a bundle of leftover food into her bag like it was something she wasn't supposed to have. And for the first time in years, Garrett Sullivan wondered if he'd been missing something all along. Garrett wasn't an impulsive man. He didn't make decisions based on fleeting emotions or gut feelings. Everything he did was calculated, measured, deliberate. But as he stood from his desk, rolling down his shirt sleeves and grabbing his hat. His feet moved before his logic could stop them. By the time he stepped outside, the evening air had turned cool, carrying the scent of sage and dust. The last traces of sunlight were fading, behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the freighty yard. Clara was already at the edge of town, walking toward the old wagon trail that led east into the open desert. No horse, no wagon of her own, just her and the weight on her back. Garrett hesitated. This was crossing a line. What business did he have following one of his workers home? What would he even say if she turned around and saw him? But when Clara kept walking, disappearing around the bend past the livery stable, Garrett found himself following anyway. He kept his distance, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice, but close enough to keep her in sight. The main road through Redemption Springs was still busy, merchants closing up shop, families heading home for supper, a few ranch hands laughing outside the saloon. But as Clara moved farther from the center of town, the landscape began to change. The neat wooden storefronts gave way to smaller, weathered buildings. The road turned from packed dirt to loose gravel and sand. Fences sagged, porches tilted, the kind of place where people scraped by, where survival came before comfort. Garrett had lived in Redemption Springs for 15 years, but he realized then that he'd never been to this part of town. Not really. It existed on the same maps, under the same sky, but it was a different world. Clara walked with purpose, even in exhaustion. Her stride was steady, practiced like she'd made this journey 1,000 times before. She didn't look around, didn't pause to rest, just kept moving forward, one foot in front of the other. How many nights had she done this? How many times had she walked this same road after working shifts that should have been impossible? The thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. She turned off the main trail onto a narrow path that cut between two rocky hills, leading toward a cluster of small homesteads, barely visible in the fading light. Garrett slowed, hanging back near a stand of cottonwood trees. He could still see her silhouette against the darkening sky, a lone figure carrying more than just a satchel. Finally, Clara reached a small structure at the end of the path, a modest homestead, if you could even call it that. The roof sagged in places, the walls were patched with mismatched boards. A single window glowed faintly with candlelight. She climbed the 2 wooden steps to the door, pulled out a key, and pushed it open. Garrett stopped just beyond the property line, hidden in the shadows of the hillside. He knew he shouldn't be here, knew this was wrong, but something kept him rooted in place. Through the thin, cracked window, he could see inside. The homestead was bare. Not the kind of bare where someone had just moved in, but the kind where someone had been living with nothing for a long time. No table, no chairs, just a single mattress on the floor, a few threadbare blankets, and a wooden crate with neatly folded clothes stacked on top. And then 2 small heads peeked out from behind the blankets. Children. Garrett's chest tightened. Clara knelt beside them, her movement slow but gentle, her exhaustion melting away the moment she saw their faces. She pulled the bundle from her satchel and unwrapped it carefully like it was something fragile, something precious. The children, a boy and a girl no older than 6 or 7, scooted forward immediately. Their eyes were wide, their movements quick. Not the casual reach of children grabbing a snack, but something more urgent. The kind of hunger that came from waiting too long. Clara split the cornbread and beans between them, making sure each got an equal share. But she didn't eat. She just watched, and Garrett stood there in the shadows, the weight of what he was seeing pressing down on him like a stone. Garrett had spent years building a business, pushing his workers to perform, believing that hard work was the answer to everything. But standing there in the dark, watching through that cracked window, he realized he had never truly looked at them, never stopped to consider what happened after they left the freighter, never asked what it cost them to show up every single day. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor beside her children, watching them eat with an expression that made Garrett's throat tighten. It wasn't just love in her eyes. It was relief. Relief that tonight, at least, they wouldn't go to bed hungry. The boy, maybe 6 years old, ate quickly, almost desperately, while the younger girl took smaller bites, savoring each one like it might be her last meal for a while. Clara reached out and smoothed the girl's hair, whispering something Garrett couldn't hear. The girl nodded, chewing slowly, and Clara's hand lingered on her daughter's head for a moment longer before pulling away. She didn't take a single bite. Garrett watched as she stood, moved to the corner of the room, and pulled a thin blanket from the crate. She wrapped it around her shoulders and sat down against the wall, her eyes closing for just a moment. The exhaustion was written all over her face. Not just physical tiredness, but the kind of weariness that came from carrying an impossible weight for far too long. The children finished eating and crawled onto the mattress, curling up beneath the worn blankets. Clara opened her eyes and watched them settle, her expression soft but distant, like she was calculating something in her head. Probably how many more shifts she'd need to pick up. How many more nights she could stretch a single meal. How much longer she could keep this going. Garrett's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had always believed in fairness. Work hard, get paid, simple, clean. But what he was seeing now wasn't fair. It wasn't even close. Clara worked double shifts, sometimes triple. She showed up early, stayed late, never complained. If anyone in his company deserved to live comfortably, it was her. And yet here she was in a home that barely qualified as shelter, splitting one meager meal between her children while she went without. How had he missed this? How had he not seen it? The answer was simple, and it stung. Because he'd never looked. He'd built his empire on the backs of workers like Clara, convinced that as long as he paid them what the job was worth, he'd done his part. But wages didn't account for medical bills, didn't account for sick children, or broken wagon axles or roofs that leaked when it rained. Didn't account for the fact that some people were starting from so far behind that even hard work couldn't close the gap. Clara stood again, moving to the window. For a moment, Garrett thought she'd seen him, and his breath caught. But she wasn't looking outside. She was just staring into the darkness, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the candle behind her. She looked hollow, worn down, like someone who had been fighting a battle no one else could see. And then she did something that broke him. She pressed her hand against the window frame and let out a slow, shaking breath. Not a sob. She didn't cry. But the sound was worse than tears. It was the sound of someone who had nothing left to give, but kept giving anyway. Garrett stepped back, his chest tight, his mind racing. He had followed her here, thinking he'd find an answer, an explanation, maybe even a simple solution. Help her out, move on, keep the business running. But what he'd found was something far more complicated. This wasn't just about Clara. It was about every worker who had ever walked the same road. Every person who showed up day after day, doing backbreaking work only to go home to nothing. For the first time in his life, Garrett Sullivan wasn't sure if hard work was enough. And worse, he wasn't sure it ever had been. He turned and walked back toward town, the weight of what he'd seen settling deep in his bones. By morning, everything would change. Garrett barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara's face pressed against that window, heard the quiet desperation in her breath, saw those children eating like they didn't know when the next meal would come. By the time dawn broke over Redemption Springs, he'd made his decision. He arrived at the freight yard earlier than usual, before most of the workers had even shown up. The air was still cool, the sky painted in soft shades of pink and gold. He paced his office, rehearsing what he'd say, trying to find the right words, but every version felt inadequate. How do you tell someone you saw their suffering? How do you admit you'd been blind to it all along? When Clara arrived for her shift an hour later, Garrett was waiting. He watched from the window as she climbed down from a supply wagon that had given her a ride into town. Her movement stiff and tired. She carried the same satchel, wore the same worn dress, and walked with the same quiet determination that had always made her invisible. He sent word through Pete to ask her to come to his office. 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," Garrett said, his voice rougher than he intended. Clara stepped inside, and the moment she saw him, her entire body tensed. Her eyes widened just slightly, and her hands gripped the strap of her satchel like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly, her voice careful, guarded. "You wanted to see me," Garrett gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Clara." She hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wouldn't look at him, directly, and he could see the fear in the set of her jaw, the way her shoulders hunched slightly forward, like she was bracing for a blow. She thought she was in trouble. Garrett exhaled slowly and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Clara's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "Yes, sir. How long have you been living out past the East Trail in that homestead?" Her face went pale. For a moment she didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Then slowly she lifted her gaze to meet his, and he saw it. The shame, the fear, the crushing weight of being seen. "You followed me," she whispered. "I did." Garrett didn't apologize. He wasn't sure he should. "And I saw everything." Clara's hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles going white. "Mr. Sullivan, please. I didn't steal that food. Pete offered it to me. I would never." "I know," Garrett said firmly, cutting her off. "This isn't about the food, Clara. This is about why you needed to ask for it in the first place." Her jaw trembled, and for a moment he thought she might break down, but she didn't. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and forced herself to hold his gaze. "I work hard, Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with quiet defiance. "I show up every day. I do everything you ask and more. I don't complain. I don't cause trouble. I just need this job." "I know you do," Garrett said, "and you're one of the best workers I've got. But that's exactly why I don't understand. You pull more shifts than almost anyone here. You should be able to afford more then." He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. "More than what I saw last night." Clara looked away, her voice cracking. "It's not enough." "What do you mean it's not enough?" She let out a shaky breath, and when she spoke again, the dam finally broke. "My husband died 2 years ago. Fever took him in 3 days. The doctor's bills wiped out everything we had. Then the landlord in town raised the rent, and I couldn't keep up, so we got evicted. That homestead, it's all I could afford, belongs to a man who doesn't care if the roof leaks or the walls let in the cold as long as I pay him every month." Garrett felt the air leave his lungs. "I work double shifts, sometimes triple," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength even as tears slipped down her cheeks. "I take every job you offer, but it's still not enough. By the time I pay for the homestead, for firewood, for the basics, there's barely anything left. Some weeks I have to choose between feeding my children or fixing a wagon wheel, and I'll choose them every single time." She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, her voice breaking. "So, yes, Mr. Sullivan, I asked Pete for leftovers because my kids were hungry and I didn't have anything else to give them." The silence that followed was suffocating. Garrett sat back in his chair, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a boulder. He had built his business on the belief that hard work led to success, that if you put in the effort, you'd be rewarded. But Clara had put in the effort. She'd done everything right, and it still wasn't enough. For the first time in his life, Garrett Sullivan realized that fairness wasn't the same as justice, and he had no idea how to fix it. Garrett stared at Clara for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with everything unsaid. She sat across from him, shoulders trembling slightly, tears still wet on her cheeks, but her chin was up, defiant, proud. Even in her brokenness, she refused to crumble completely. He respected that more than she'd ever know. "Clara," he said finally, his voice low and steady, "you're not in trouble and you're not going to lose this job. I need you to understand that first." Her breath hitched, and she nodded, though the fear in her eyes didn't fully fade. Garrett leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "What I saw last night, it's not right. And the fact that you've been carrying this alone, working yourself to the bone and still barely scraping by, that's on me." Clara's brow furrowed. "Mr. Sullivan, you pay fair wages, you always have. This isn't your fault, isn't it?" Garrett's jaw tightened. "I've spent years building this company, convincing myself that as long as I paid what the job was worth, I'd done my part. But I never asked what happened after you clocked out. Never thought about whether the wages I was paying were enough to actually live on. I just assumed if you worked hard, you'd make it." He exhaled, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "But you've been working harder than anyone, and you're still drowning. So maybe I've been wrong this whole time." Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak. Garrett stood, pacing toward the window that overlooked the freight yard. Below, workers were beginning their day, loading crates, hitching horses, shouting instructions to one another. Good people, hard-working people. And he had to wonder how many of them were struggling the same way Clara was, too proud or too afraid to say anything. "I can't fix this with charity," Garrett said, more to himself than to her. "Handing you money, paying for your homestead, that's a bandage. It helps you, but it doesn't change anything for the next person or the person after that." He turned back to face her. "So, I'm going to do something bigger." Clara blinked, confusion crossing her face. "What do you mean?" "I'm going to change how this company works," Garrett said, his voice firm with conviction. "Wages, benefits, emergency funds for workers who fall on hard times. I don't have all the answers yet, but I'm going to find them. And I'm going to make sure no one who works for me has to choose between feeding their children and keeping a roof over their heads." Clara's mouth opened, but no words came out. She stared at him like she didn't quite believe what she was hearing. "This isn't just about you, Clara," Garrett continued. "It's about everyone. It's about building something better, something that doesn't just work people into the ground and call it fair." For a moment, Clara just sat there, her hands trembling in her lap. Then quietly, almost too quietly to hear, she said, "Why?" Garrett met her gaze. "Because it's the right thing to do." She shook her head slowly, tears welling up again. "You don't have to do this." "Yes," Garrett said firmly. "I do." An hour later, Garrett was in his office alone, the door shut, a telegram in his hand. He'd sent for Ezra Blackwell, his business partner, and the man who managed the books. If anyone could help him figure out how to restructure wages without gutting the company, it was Ezra. The door opened and Ezra stepped in. A tall, lean man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a non-nonsense demeanor. He took one look at Garrett's face and raised an eyebrow. "You look like a man who's about to do something stupid," Ezra said, closing the door behind him. Garrett let out a dry laugh. "Depends on how you define stupid." Ezra crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "All right. What's this about?" Garrett didn't waste time. He told him everything, following Clara, what he'd seen, the conversation they'd had. By the time he finished, Ezra was silent, his expression unreadable. "So, let me get this straight," Ezra said slowly. "You want to raise wages across the board, add benefits, and set up some kind of emergency fund for workers in trouble?" "That's right." Ezra exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Garrett, you know what the investors are going to say. You know what the town council's going to say. Hell, You know what half the other business owners are going to say. I know, Garrett said, and I don't care. Ezra studied him for a long moment, then let out a low chuckle. Damn, you really saw something out there, didn't you? I did. Garrett's voice was quiet, but resolute, and I can't unsee it. Ezra pushed off the doorframe, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, if we're doing this, we're doing it smart. I'll run the numbers, figure out what we can afford without tanking the company. But Garrett, this is going to be a fight. Garrett's grip tightened on the edge of his desk. He thought of Clara sitting in his office with tears on her face, telling him it wasn't enough. Then we fight, Garrett said. Ezra smirked. Damn right we do. The meeting hall in Redemption Springs was packed. Garrett sat at the head of a long oak table, flanked by Ezra on one side and a stack of carefully prepared reports on the other. Across from him sat the investors and town council members who had stakes in Sullivan Freight and Cattle Company, men who had backed him financially over the years, men who expected returns, not speeches about fairness. Thomas Brennan, a cattle investor with deep pockets and a deeper sense of entitlement, sat directly across from Garrett, arms folded, jaw set. Margaret Calloway, a silver-haired landowner who'd been in the Arizona Territory longer than anyone else in the room, sat near the end of the table, her sharp eyes watching everything with quiet calculation. The air was thick with tension. Garrett cleared his throat and leaned forward. Gentlemen, Margaret, thank you for coming. I know this meeting was called on short notice, but what I'm about to propose can't wait. Thomas snorted. This better be good, Sullivan. I've got cattle to move. Garrett ignored the jab. I'm proposing a restructuring of how we pay and support our workers. Across the board, wage increases, emergency funds for those who fall on hard times, better living conditions, long-term support, not just short-term fixes. The room went silent. Then Thomas laughed, sharp, incredulous, mocking. You've got to be joking. I'm not, Garrett said evenly. Thomas leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. Let me make sure I understand this. You want us, the people who invested in this company, to approve pay raises and charity funds for what? Out of the kindness of our hearts. Out of basic decency, Garrett shot back. We're not running a charity, Sullivan, Thomas said, his voice rising. We're running a business. Our workers are already paid competitively for this territory. If we start handing out raises and emergency funds like candy, where does it end? And what do you think happens to our profit margins when word gets out that Sullivan Freight is playing Santa Claus? A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Garrett could feel the resistance building, the skepticism hardening into outright opposition, but he'd prepared for this. We're a freight and cattle company, Garrett said, his voice steady but firm. We don't make products. We don't invent new tools. We move goods and livestock. And the only reason we do it better than anyone else is because of the people on the ground, the ones loading the wagons, driving the cattle, working through the night to meet our deadlines. They're not numbers on a ledger. They're people. And right now, they're being left behind. Ezra slid a report across the table. We've run the numbers, he said. Yes, this plan will cost us up front, but turnover rates, those are bleeding us dry faster than any wage increase ever could. The time and money we spend constantly hiring, constantly training new workers because the good ones burn out or leave for better opportunities. It's unsustainable. Margaret picked up the report, her eyes scanning the figures. She didn't say anything, but Garrett could see her mind working. Thomas wasn't convinced. And what if this doesn't work? What if all we do is lose money and watch our competition laugh while we go under? Garrett met his gaze without flinching. Then I take the loss personally. The room went still. Thomas narrowed his eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying if this plan fails, I'll cut my own salary to cover the difference, Garrett said. I built this company. If we go down, I go down with it. But I'm telling you right now, we won't, because I believe in this, I believe in them. And if I'm willing to put my own earnings on the line for it, then you need to ask yourselves why you're not. The silence that followed was suffocating. Garrett could see the shock on their faces, the wheels turning as they processed what he just said. Margaret set the report down and looked up, her voice calm but pointed. I think it's time we started thinking beyond the next quarter. I've seen too many businesses in this territory rise and fall because they didn't invest in their people. If Garrett's willing to stake his own future on this, then maybe we should be paying attention. She looked around the table. I vote yes. One by one, the votes began to shift. Not unanimous, not without resistance, but enough. Enough to change everything. Thomas glared at Garrett, his jaw tight, but even he didn't fight it anymore. By the time the meeting ended, Garrett stepped out into the afternoon sun, Ezra beside him. When you said you were serious, Ezra muttered, shaking his head, I didn't think you meant your own damn salary. Garrett let out a slow breath. It worked, didn't it? Ezra smirked. Yeah, it did. Word spread fast in Redemption Springs. By the next morning, every worker at Sullivan Freight and Cattle Company had heard whispers of something big coming. Changes, raises, new policies, but no one knew the details. No one knew if it was real or just another rumor that would fade by sundown. Garrett stood at the edge of the freight yard, watching his workers arrive for the day. They moved with the same tired determination they always had. Hauling crates, checking wagon wheels, shouting instructions across the dusty lot. Clara was among them, her head down, her movements careful and practiced. She hadn't said much to him since their conversation 2 days ago, and he didn't blame her. She was probably still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Ezra approached from behind, a rolled-up notice in his hand. You ready for this? Garrett nodded. Get everyone together. Ezra let out a sharp whistle, the sound cutting through the noise of the yard. Everyone front and center. Mr. Sullivan's got something to say. The workers stopped what they were doing, exchanging uncertain glances. Slowly, they gathered in a loose semicircle around Garrett. Some curious, some wary, all of them wondering what this was about. Clara stood near the back, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. Garrett stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. He wasn't a man who gave speeches, wasn't the type to waste words, but this mattered. I know most of you have heard rumors, Garrett began, his voice steady and clear. So, I'm here to set the record straight. As of today, Sullivan Freight and Cattle Company is making changes. Real changes. The murmuring grew louder. Garrett raised a hand and the crowd quieted. First, he continued, wages are going up across the board. No exceptions. If you work here, you're getting a raise. A ripple of shock ran through the group. A few workers glanced at each other, disbelief written all over their faces. Second, Garrett said, we're setting up an emergency fund. If you fall on hard times, sickness, injury, family trouble, you won't have to face it alone. We'll help. Clara's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide. Third, Garrett pressed on. We're improving conditions, better hours, safer equipment, and if you've got family depending on you, we'll make sure you're not choosing between work and taking care of them. The silence was deafening now. No one spoke. No one moved. They just stared at him, like they weren't sure they'd heard him right. Garrett's jaw tightened, his voice dropping but caring all the same. For too long, I believed that as long as I paid fair wages, I'd done my part. But I was wrong. Fair isn't the same as enough, and I didn't see that until I saw what some of you are going through just to survive. His gaze found Clara in the crowd. Her face was wet with tears, but she didn't look away. You work harder than anyone should have to, Garrett said, speaking to all of them now. You show up every day, do backbreaking work, and you never complain. But that doesn't mean you should have to struggle. It doesn't mean you should have to go without, and it sure as hell doesn't mean I get to pretend I don't see it. He took a breath, steadying himself. So, this isn't charity. This is what you've earned. This is what you deserve. And if anyone has a problem with that, investors, competitors, anyone. They can take it up with me. For a moment, no one said anything. Then from somewhere in the crowd, someone started clapping. Slow at first, then louder. Others joined in, the sound building until the entire yard was filled with applause, with shouts, with something that sounded almost like hope. Clara stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, and she looked at Garrett with an expression he'd never forget. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. Belief, the kind of belief that came from someone who'd been invisible finally being seen. Garrett nodded at her just once, and she nodded back. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low over the Arizona desert, Garrett stood in his office watching the workers head home. But this time, it felt different. This time he knew that when they walked out those gates, they weren't walking toward desperation. Ezra stepped into the doorway, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You know you just made yourself a target, right? Every other company in the territory is going to hate you for this. Garrett shrugged. Let them. Ezra chuckled. Well, for what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Garrett turned, his gaze settling on the horizon. It's not about what I think anymore, Ezra. It's about them. And for the first time in years, Garrett Sullivan felt like he'd finally built something worth keeping. If you enjoyed this story of change, resilience, and doing what's right, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful tales from the Wild West. Drop a comment and let us know what you think. Should more people stand up like Garrett did? We'll see you in the next one. 3 weeks had passed since Garrett announced the changes at Sullivan Freight and Cattle Company. The raises had gone into effect. The emergency fund was established. Workers were smiling more, standing a little taller, and the entire atmosphere of the freight yard had shifted from grinding survival to something that almost resembled hope. But Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something he didn't understand about Clara Winters. One evening, as he walked through town, he noticed a bronze plaque on the schoolhouse he'd passed 100 times before. In the fading light, the words finally caught his eye. This schoolhouse, built in 1878 through the generous contribution of Clara Winters. Asterisk. Garrett's heart stopped. Clara Winters, 1878. 5 years ago, he went straight to the general store, where Henry, the shopkeeper, told him the rest. Clara and her late husband, James, had struck silver 6 years back. Instead of hoarding their wealth, they had built the schoolhouse, funded the town well, and helped rebuild the church after a storm. They had given everything to lift others up. Then James died from fever 2 years ago. Clara spent everything she had left trying to save him. When it was over, she had nothing. And because she'd given so much away in silence, no one remembered what she'd sacrificed. She built half this town, Henry said quietly, the parts that matter anyway. Garrett stood in the street, staring at the schoolhouse, the well, the church. Clara Winters hadn't just worked hard. She'd built the foundation this entire town stood on, and no one had ever thanked her for it until now. 2 days later, Garrett called for a town meeting. Word spread quickly, and by evening the meeting hall was packed. Workers, merchants, families, even the investors who'd fought him weeks earlier. Clara sat near the back, confused about why she'd been asked to attend. Her children sat beside her, their eyes wide as they took in the crowd. Garrett stood at the front, Ezra beside him. He cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. Most of you know that 3 weeks ago we made changes at Sullivan Freight, Garrett began. Wage increases, emergency funds, better conditions. I did that because I finally opened my eyes to how hard people were working just to survive. He paused, his gaze finding Clara in the crowd. But what I didn't know, what none of us seemed to remember, was that one of those people had already given this town more than any of us deserved. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Clara's face went pale. Clara Winters, Garrett said, his voice strong and clear. 6 years ago, when she and her husband struck silver, they didn't hoard it. They didn't build a mansion or leave town for somewhere fancier. They built the schoolhouse so our children could learn. They funded the well so families didn't have to haul water for miles. They rebuilt the church after the storm destroyed it. The room went completely silent. People turned to look at Clara, shock and recognition dawning on their faces. And when her husband died 2 years ago, Garrett continued, she spent everything she had left trying to save him. Everything. She gave to this town when she had plenty, and when she had nothing, this town forgot about her. Clara's hands covered her face, tears streaming between her fingers. I'm not going to let that stand, Garrett said firmly. Clara Winters built the foundation we all stand on. She worked herself to exhaustion for this company, for her children, asking for nothing in return. So today I'm asking all of you to remember, to see her, to honor what she's done. He gestured to Ezra, who stepped forward with a deed in his hand. Clara, Garrett said, his voice softening. That homestead you've been renting? I bought it. It's yours now. Free and clear. No rent, no landlord. It's the least this town owes you. Clara stood on shaking legs, her children clinging to her sides. The entire room erupted in applause, not polite clapping, but thunderous, genuine, filled with recognition and gratitude and shame for having forgotten. Garrett walked down the aisle and handed her the deed. She took it with trembling hands, tears pouring down her face. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Thank you. No, Garrett said quietly, so only she could hear. Thank you for everything you built, everything you gave, everything you are. That night, as Garrett stood outside the meeting hall, watching families walk home under the stars, Ezra joined him. You know that homestead cost you a small fortune, Ezra said. Garrett shrugged. Worth every penny. Ezra smiled. Yeah, it was. Garrett looked back at the town, the schoolhouse, the well, the church, all standing because one woman had believed in something bigger than herself. And now, finally, everyone knew her name. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful tales of redemption and recognition from Lonely Range Tales. Comment below and tell us who's someone in your life who deserves to be honored.